Reorganizing for Stalemate. Since 1948, there has been a drive to unify American military forces under a single head along the lines of the old German Unified Command, despite the fact that this cumbersome totalitarian system was a primary reason for Germany's defeat. Unification also ignores lessons of history and the experience of American fighting men. Inter-service competition has been partly responsible for the high morale of Americans in battle, and diversified command has permitted flexibility and individual initiative during times of crisis. The step-by-step creation of a monolithic single-head command structure for our armed forces is pushing us toward military dictatorship, not by experienced military men, but by civilian theorists who are converting the armed forces into a political-economic pressure complex to support administration policies. That is a summary of my report on Reorganizing for Stalemate. The full report after a message from my sponsor. During the heaviest fighting of World War II, General George C. Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, found time to propose a general reorganization of the U.S. military establishment. Marshall wanted centralization of power, which would put all services under one Chief of Staff, responsible to one Secretary of Defense. Arguments for such a monolithic structure in our armed forces have some theoretical plausibility: elimination of inter-service rivalry, better coordination of all forces, elimination of duplication and waste. But the theory ignores lessons of history and the combat experience of American fighting men. Inter-service competition has been in large part responsible for the superior morale and esprit de corps which distinguish Americans in combat, which can be, and in many critical times have been, more important than weapons, supplies, or organization. Temporary arrangements for unified battle action by separate and rival branches of American military forces have produced brilliant success, often because the arrangements necessarily left a great deal of leeway for individual initiative on the part of lower echelon commanders. A massive military operation which spreads across thousands of miles and involves millions of men with all types of equipment under a multitude of unpredictable conditions can be choked to death through unification and tight control by one desk man at the top. As to waste and duplication, these are perennial evils of bureaucracy, military and civilian. There seems to be a law of proportion which should counsel us to keep the military and the civilian bureaucracy divided and fragmented into the smallest rival units possible. Waste, duplication, and inefficiency of a governmental unit, agency, or department, military or civilian, seem to multiply in geometric proportions as the size of the unit increases, which means that a governmental unit large enough to have a $2 billion budget is generally about 4 times as wasteful and inefficient as one large enough to have a $1 billion budget. The George Marshall clique in the Pentagon, which included Eisenhower, pushed hard for the unification plan of having a single Chief of Staff and a single Secretary of Defense. But the thin plausibility of their arguments did not carry enough weight. In 1946, Army historians asked 3 former Chiefs of Staff of the German Army to tell what happened on their side during the war and to give their views on the proposed reorganization of our armed forces. The 3 were Generals Franz Halder, Kurt Zeitzler, and Heinz Guderian. Of the 3, Guderian was belligerent and uncooperative. Halder and Zeitzler avoided making recommendations, but did prepare a historical study reflecting opposition to the kind of centralized power being proposed for the American military. Halder and Zeitzler, like a great majority of German generals, felt that the single Chief of Staff arrangement, with tight concentration of power in one man, was a primary reason for Germany's defeat. It produced rigidity in times of crisis, prohibiting commanders from altering plans to meet unforeseen developments, holding German forces to a preconceived plan of action which battlefield developments rendered ineffective, even suicidal. These German generals seemed in sympathy with Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, Hitler's successor as Führer, who rejects the fascist communist ideal of concentrated political power and advocates a governmental system based on old American constitutional principles. The George Marshall clique of political managers who dominated Pentagon planning in the post-war period disliked the ideas of such Germans as Halder, Zeitzler, and Dönitz. They turned to the bellicose Guderian for a recommendation. Guderian is one of very few German generals who advocates the totalitarian state. In 1947, President Truman took an initial major step toward military centralization when, authorized by Congress, he eliminated the old departments of War and Navy and created the single Department of Defense. And in 1948, Guderian submitted his plan for reorganizing the American armed forces. The Guderian plan would create an all-powerful military dictatorship with the president as its totalitarian head or its tool. Guderian would not only establish the old German unified command system, but would also put the military high command in tight control of civilian aviation, civilian transportation, and civilian communications, which means radio, television, press, telegraph, and telephone services. The Guderian plan has become a blueprint for all U.S. military reorganization plans made or attempted since 1948. The total plan, not yet in effect, is being achieved a step at a time. Congress has permitted these dangerous developments by abdicating its own constitutional powers and responsibilities. The Constitution gives to Congress exclusively the responsibility of raising and maintaining armed forces for the United States. Congress, shirking its sworn duty, has passed this constitutional responsibility to the President, who delegates it to egghead intellectuals and who think college degrees are a proper substitute for brains and wisdom, who have no experience in combat and know nothing about the realities of fighting a war. In 1953, President Eisenhower appointed Nelson Rockefeller, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as head of a commission to make a study and proposal for military reorganization. The Rockefeller report, recommending more centralization of power, became the basis of an Eisenhower reorganization plan which concentrated more power than theretofore in the Secretary of Defense and in the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It seemed a timid step. More propaganda work on the Congress and on the public was needed before bolder measures could be taken without arousing the nation. The Council on Foreign Relations undertook the propaganda job subtly and unobtrusively, of course. J. Robert Oppenheimer, notorious former associate of communist espionage agents and member of the Council on Foreign Relations, wrote an article for the July 1953 issue of Foreign Affairs, advocating de-emphasis and eventual elimination of nuclear weapons from American armed forces, arguing for conventional forces and armaments which might produce stalemate with, rather than victory over, enemy forces. In 1954, the CFR organized discussion groups to study foreign policy and defense in the nuclear age. All of the emphasis was on preventing American preparation for a nuclear war. Good sense and logic seemed, however, to have more influence on public thought than CFR efforts had. It was obvious that America could not match the communist slave empire in manpower for the kind of conventional forces that Oppenheimer and others urged us to depend on. We could, however, with our superior technology and industrial capacity, outstrip the Soviets in production of nuclear and other new types of weapons. It was obvious that the next war would be fought with the new weapons, that it would be short and violent, and that it would probably be over before massive land armies and other conventional forces and weapons were ever brought into action. International political events also made it obvious that American dependence on foreign bases left us at the mercy of foreign nations, who, even in time of peace when they were on the American dole, often seemed friendlier to the Soviets than to us. Dependence on such nations, or use of bases on their soil, in times of war when they would be under blackmail threats for the Soviet Union, could be disastrous. A growing public comprehension of such obvious conditions led to a revival of the traditional and sound Fortress America concept of national defense. The concept that we must defend our homeland because we have neither the responsibility nor the capability of defending and policing the world. Leading military men with combat experience like Admiral Arthur Radford publicly supported the idea of de-emphasizing foreign bases and foreign military entanglements, arguing for a reduction of spending on conventional forces so that our resources could be devoted to production of such superweapons as missiles and intercontinental supersonic bombers, which would deter enemy aggression by threatening enemy destruction in the event of war. The Council on Foreign Relations intensified its propaganda efforts. In 1957 and 1958, a rash of pretentious books, studies, and reports prepared by CFR members or under CFR auspices hammered the theme that control of our military establishments should be tightly concentrated at the top, and that the emphasis in our weapons development, strategy, troop indoctrination, and general policy should be on stalemate and compromise rather than victory. The propaganda barrage had enough effect on Congress and the public that Eisenhower in 1958 managed to take one more step toward implementing the Guderian Plan, further concentrating power in the Secretary of Defense and in the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, shifting responsibility for military planning away from officers with combat experience, putting it in the hands of desk officers and civilians. With the groundwork prepared, President Kennedy and his Secretary of Defense, McNamara, have taken giant strides toward converting the American armed forces into a mammoth political economic pressure complex controlled by inexperienced civilian intellectuals and theorists to support the administration's political objectives. More on this next week. Goodbye. God bless you. For the full documented text of this broadcast, send 25 cents to Dan Smoot, Dallas 14, Texas, and ask for 423, Reorganizing for Stalemate. 6 copies, $1.